Welcome back for another session of the Departure Lounge. We are really excited to have this conversation. This is Erin Schmidt from LilyPad Strategies, and we're going to have the very important and not often talked about conversation about what foundations owe the community and their grantees when they decide to spend down. Erin, before we start, will you just share where people can find you if they want to check out your website while they're listening and watching?
Sure. They can go to lilypadstrategies.com. And we have places on there for folks to join our email list if they would like. We send out regular free comms tips for mission-driven communities. So definitely check that out if you're interested.
Amazing. My first question for you is really around this trend. Like, we are really hearing more and more lately, it feels like, about foundation spend downs and foundation sunsetting. What do you think is driving that trend? Is it just normalization? Are we just talking about it more? Is there something else going on?
Yeah, great question. I think it's still pretty rare. I think it's still too rare, which we can talk about in a bit. But, it's hard to get totally accurate data on how large the trend is. But I think, 20 years ago, I think the estimates were around 9 to 12% of foundations were in active spend down, and about a quarter of them were considering it. Newer research from 2025 from the National Center on Family Philanthropy estimates that about 9 to 13% of family foundations are in active spend down, and about 28% are considering it. So certainly a little bit of an uptick, both in the decision to do it and folks thinking about it, which is good. I think also there's this aspect of there have been some pretty notable and well-known groups that are deciding to make this decision and are communicating about it in really good ways. And so we're starting to have more of the conversation in the philanthropy and the nonprofit worlds about this decision and what it means and how to do it well. So I think that's definitely also helping. But it is still rare. And I think in terms of what's driving the trend, I think anybody who works in nonprofit world, this will not be a shock. It is just a really, really difficult time for the nonprofit sector right now, specifically. I would say the sector is under siege, and that is not hyperbole. I think a lot of the funding streams that nonprofits historically relied on are narrowing or disappearing entirely. Federal funding streams in particular, if you look at, for example, USAID, international aid, I mean, there's a sector that has collapsed pretty much overnight. But even if we look at sort of nationally, some of these really important issue areas, immigration, domestic violence, food benefits, a lot of that federal funding has either been significantly reduced or has dried up. And so nonprofits are having to find ways to fill those funding gaps. We're also in an economic recession, and that means that individual giving is way down. So there's another slice of the pie that nonprofits have historically relied on that they're not able to. And so what are they doing? A lot of them are looking towards foundation grants, private giving. And, even in that space, so now there's much higher demand, only a limited number of groups that are giving out money in very specific cause areas. And so, I think the TLDR is that the gap between what nonprofits need and what the current environment can provide has never felt wider. And I think that's leading to, rightfully, increasing scrutiny and attention on funders and what their responsibility is in a moment like this. Frustration, I think, with half measures. I think the sort of the traditional model is that a foundation has anywhere from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in an endowment. They invest that endowment. They pay out maybe 2 to 5% per year on grant making, and the rest of it sits is investing, and they exist in perpetuity. That model is not meeting the needs of the moment, and so I'm very heartened to see the conversation that's happening right now, and in talking with groups, foundations who are considering this. Their boards are actively considering this, or they have decided to make the leap to spend down. Um, that is um, that is a signal that more of these groups are starting to feel the moral weight of the position that they're in, and they're actively considering whether an accelerated spend down of their endowment is perhaps the better way in this moment to realize their mission, to realize what it is that they're here for. So I think that's heartening for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about when you were talking about the numbers of however many millions of dollars they have in their endowment and they invest back into the communities, 2 to 5%. We just had a call with our financial planner, and she was talking about retirement strategies around living off of the interest from your investments. And I'm like, oh, that's what foundations are doing, is granting the interest potentially. And it just makes me think, how much bolder, how much more courageous could we be from a philanthropic mindset? It doesn't necessarily have to mean spend down, but could you spend up? Could you,
Yeah.
could you lean in a little bit? Could you talk, Erin, a little bit about the big, hairy elephant in the room, and what foundations really do owe their grantees and the broader community when they make a decision to either spend down or not spend down? Curious where foundations tend to fall short and what you and your work would tell them to do differently.
Yeah, I
It's a
think
big, big topic.
it's a big elephant in the room, and it's the really important elephant in the room. It's important to have these courageous conversations. So I think the first thing I would say is start with the power dynamic and be honest about it, truly. You know, we live in a world of staggering inequality. Wealth is getting concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, while the needs of communities across the country and the world are only continuing to grow. And the organizations who are on the front lines, the nonprofits and community groups who are providing these direct services to their communities, they are hurting. They are chronically underfunded. They're understaffed. Staff are being asked to wear multiple hats, assume, 3 different full-time positions. There's incredible burnout, and they're under-resourced. And they are being asked in this moment to solve enormous problems with really threadbare budgets, really high staff turnover, and again, as we talked about, these funding relationships that can disappear overnight. Um, that is an enormous weight on these leaders who are doing really critical work in our communities. And, I think there certainly are lots of smart thinkers. I'm still learning, but people who have written about this, thought about this for years. Um, Edgar Villanueva, Decolonizing Wealth is a great one. It's this idea of philanthropy as a system that was built on extracted wealth. And so the question is whether the way in which you give either challenges or reinforces the structures that created that inequality in the first place. And I think this big question. I think a spend down is a huge opportunity for foundations to do something structural about that power dynamic. And the way that they can do that is by putting significantly more money into the hands of the organizations who are doing the work, who know their communities, do it on a much faster timeline and with fewer strings attached, which we can talk about in a bit. But I think the really important thing here is that they do so in a way with care and thought for what happens to those organizations and to those communities after the foundation is gone. It's, again, turning that whole model on its head and saying, what would it look like if we did not exist in perpetuity? What would it look like to funnel significant amounts of money into these organizations and these communities, to put trust in those organizations, into our grantees, and help to build the capacity and build the sustainability so that they can not only survive, but thrive after that funding source is gone. So I think, in many ways, deciding to spend the money is the easiest part of this decision and this process. I mean, that is the easy part. What comes after that is the much harder question. It forces foundations to reckon with those really uncomfortable systems questions. Who decides how the money gets used? Who has power in this relationship? What does it mean to trust our grantees? And what do you owe the communities you've been funding when you decide to leave? And that sustainability question is the real test. I think while it's still rare, the foundations that are deciding to spend down their endowments, the vast majority are doing it for the right reasons. They care about their communities. They want to know that the organizations and the communities that they've invested in will be standing long after they're gone. And so that's going to require totally rethinking their grant making, moving to general operating support instead of, a very specific line item for a very specific set of deliverables, larger and longer grants, putting money into intentional capacity building, leadership development, and then just being really honest about timelines. That is a huge shift from the status quo and from how many of these groups have historically done their grant making. And so that also means that it will require a very, very different kind of communication than most foundations have done before.
I just was thinking when you were saying that, Erin, how cool would it be if part of that spend down and that trust, which is, I just wrote it down 3 times and underlined it because trust is such a big part of this. What would it be like if a foundation, as they were spending down, said to their grantees, we're actually going to grant you some money to add to your reserve so that you can invest it, so that you can like,
Love that. Yeah.
could that be? I also love that you're talking so emphatically about power and trust and those dynamics, because that's the thing that we don't talk about enough in our philanthropic relationships with grantees. Is we've built this power structure that does not allow the grantees that are doing the work of serving the community to have a voice in the topic and in the matter. So I appreciate you saying that so clearly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, going back to the role of communications in this process, I think ultimately, a good communications program, a good communication strategy is about building that trust, preserving that trust, and strengthening those relationships. And I think many of these foundations, particularly the smaller and the place-based ones, they're doing that. They've been doing that work and of building that trust and building those relationships with their grantees through their historical grant making. And so deciding to invest really thoughtfully in communications as part of a spend down is a natural extension of that, building on that trust. But I think the sort of the gap that many of these groups underestimate is that, you know, for many of them, they haven't really traditionally invested a lot in their own communications and marketing infrastructure. They haven't really needed to.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and there's a sort of ethos in the foundation space of, and it's the right one, of like, we don't need to have the spotlight. We should lift up our grantees and their work, and we can be in the background supporting them, and letting them lead. And that is right. That is
But I will challenge that norm because they also aren't funding comms budget line items for their
Mm,
grantees. I
well,
mean,
that's a whole, let's
a whole
let's
nother session, Erin.
have a conversation about funding comms. Yes, comm support. But if for their grantees. But if we are talking specifically about the foundation's communications infrastructure and what they're going to need to be able to communicate the spend down over a really long arc. I mean, we're talking 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them do not have that infrastructure in place. And it's one of those things where it's like, you don't know what you don't know. Like, you don't even know what questions to be thinking about and planning for.
But you do.
Yes. And so I think, that is, I think before even a decision is made, um, comms should be in the room. But even if they're not, and the decision is made very, very quickly upon making that decision, um, foundations would do well to invest in their communication strategy and in additional support, where and when they might need it.
And I think it's important to say that it's comms can be both internal and external, and both matter the same. You know, whether it's internal with your grantees and it doesn't see the light of day, the comms and the narrative that you're pushing out and sharing, or it's external in a way to model behavior. I love that you just said like comms is the trust lever. And it does help build. And I think it's so interesting when you were talking about how foundations haven't needed to have a comms or marketing strategy. How powerful could it be for them to look at it as narrative change work instead of selling themselves?
It is
Yeah.
narrative change.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because we're changing systems
Yeah.
with a decision like this. Um, and I think, there's also good news for groups that might be in this position is that there are brave groups that have gone before them, that have blazed trails, in spending down. And so there's a lot of learnings also, from groups who have already done this, things that they got right, things that they wish they would have done differently. And so there are definitely best practices that, can help anchor a communication strategy if they're deciding to, take this leap.
Uh, can you talk a little bit about that? You've done some research and you've studied some foundations that have done it well, or maybe they haven't done it so great, and you're also in the business of providing the support to foundations as they spend down. What does good look like when you think about it from a comms lens?
Yeah. So I think first off, call every grantee before you go public with this announcement. Full stop. That is a must. Grantees should not be finding out about their funders' decision to spend down from a press release, from a website update, or from a LinkedIn post. And then there's also, like, it's a small world, right? And so you shouldn't let a lot of time go by after you've, made this decision, as a group, before very thoughtfully and intentionally having those one-on-ones with your grantees, because word gets around, right? Gossip goes around. So every grantee should hear personally from the foundation directly before a public announcement goes out. I think within 2 weeks of the board decision is a good, standard. So if your grantees are hearing about this from anyone other than someone personally at the foundation, you've already made your first communications mistake. Don't make that mistake. I think a second best practice is radical transparency over the full arc of the spend down. There, you cannot be communicating early and often enough about not only the decision and why you made it, but what happens next, the details, right? So clarity about what's changing and what isn't changing, honest timelines about when funding levels will shift, and importantly, giving grantees enough runway to plan for those changes. I think the field consensus is 18 to 24 months notice minimum before grantees experience a significant shift in funding levels. Part of that radical transparency and trust building is also having um, thoughtful and honest conversations with your grantees about what it is that they might need. What does what does that funding look like to achieve the ultimate goal of sustainability and capacity building after you're gone? So those conversations should absolutely be prioritized, and then they should be communicated everywhere, that not only, in one-on-one conversations, but on your website. Um, to that point, be honest about when the door is closing on funding. There are so many groups out there that are scouring foundation websites to see where they might have opportunities for additional grant money. And so it's really important that not only for your current grantees, but for potential applicants, that you are being very clear about when the door has closed on historic funding opportunities. You want to prevent confusion, false hope. Don't let people apply for funding that you've already decided you're not going to give. That's really, really important. And then I think a third best practice is knowledge sharing. So share what you're learning throughout the arc of that spend down and what you've learned after the doors have closed with the broader field. There are, more than a quarter of foundations are actively considering taking this leap, and they can learn a lot from your experience. So that next generation of funders, they deserve to learn from what you did.
I love that. There's also something that you and I have talked a little bit about this, but thinking of just what does live on after the final gift? Could the foundation have a period of time where their website is archived in a way that can show the impact and show those lessons? I think so often we see websites just go away, even though there's been years and decades of beautiful impact, and it just ends. And so I think that's another thing that I'm looking forward to seeing more from foundations as they spend down, is some kind of an archival system, or at least
Yes.
something that holds for 5-10 more years to say, this is what we've done together. That
I
could be
love that.
too.
I'm absolutely obsessed with one in particular, and it's the Quixote Foundation. Everybody should go check out their website. It is beautiful, fun, intentional. So you land on their landing page, and it takes you to this train of thought about impact.
Yeah.
And when you read it top to bottom, it makes no sense. It's very pessimistic and negative. Like, there's no way that we could make an impact. And if you believe that you can make a difference, think again. And then you get all the way to the bottom, and they say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Now try reading this again from the bottom to the top, and it flips the narrative. And then when you scroll back up to the top, you get a pop-up at the top that's like, now explore our exhibit, our living. It's like a digital museum of their spend down and what they did, and the impact that their grantees have had and are continuing to make in the world. That is a beautiful example of how you can ensure that sort of like the digital legacy of what you did lives on.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
I think it's so beautiful too to think about that last moment of whatever, maybe it's your decision for a final gift, maybe it's the decision of how you communicate, maybe it's the decision about how you leave the legacy. It requires us to all slow down, and it requires us to think about it, to your point, from a comms perspective. I think that underestimate the power of a good comm strategy. And so I love that you at LilyPad take this on in a way to help support that spend down. Is there anything else, Erin, that you want to share with folks on the topic before we wrap up?
I was thinking naming is really important. So there's this term in nonprofit world, not only on the grant maker side, but on the grantee side of like sunsetting. I don't know, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with that word. Maybe it's because I come from healthcare world. It reminds me of like senior care or hospice care. And ultimately, this is not an ending. This is not like the final chapter of a book. This is the beginning of, a new chapter of impact. So I think spend some time on what you decide to call this. It matters a lot in terms of how you're communicating power dynamics and values. I've heard spending up, a sunrise strategy, sunset. Going all in is another one. And that was, I believe it was the Hazen Foundation. And that was actually because they talked with their grantees about what to call this.
I love
And
that.
their grantees pushed back on the idea of spending down. And so they landed on going all in. Think about
that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Naming is really important. And then I think, this is a long process. So yes, invest early on in creating the time and the space to think about your strategy, your communication strategy throughout the arc of this spend down. Maybe there are different phases to this and different audiences that you need to communicate with at different points. So maybe you can even name the phases of your strategy and you have a roadmap. Getting that internal alignment with input from your grantees at the very outset is going to help you make the most of this really bold, courageous, and sector changing decision, and set you up for, legacy is a loaded word, I think, but yeah, like what do you want the legacy of this decision to be? And build in the time and the thinking to make sure that you can do this in a really thoughtful and meaningful way.
I love that. Erin, thank you for joining me for this conversation. Thanks for the work that you do. Will you remind folks again where they can find you and another round of what services you provide?
Yes. So LilyPad Strategies is a communications strategy and execution firm for mission-driven organizations. And we can be found at lilypadstrategies.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So if you'd love to connect there, let's do it. And we do send out regular emails with free communications tips and musings about the field. So definitely sign up for that if you would like to get that in your inbox.
Fantastic. Erin, thank you so much. Also, for the folks watching this, thanks you for joining for another session of the Departure Lounge, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, Naomi, for doing this. This has been amazing.
Absolutely.
Take care.